She was 24 years old when she became the sole custodian of 300 acres of dust, a house of sun-bleached pine, and a silence so profound it had its own weight. Her inheritance from her brother-in-law, delivered with the flat finality of a court judgment, was a single silver dollar, its face worn smooth with the passage of indifferent hands. That, and a strange, water-worn river stone her father had pressed into her palm years before he died, a piece of granite so dark and polished it felt like a solidified piece of night. He had called it a key, though it fit no lock she had ever seen, and told her stories of the stone-faced pilgrims, a lost party from the last century who vanished into this very landscape, their wagon supposedly laden with a treasure that defied imagination. The land, he'd always insisted, held more than just heartache. It held a secret, waiting for the right eyes to see it. Settle in, now, and listen to how a forgotten stone and a faithful dog rewrote the maps of this valley. Her father, Orrin, had never been much of a rancher. He was a man who walked with his gaze perpetually fixed on the ground, not searching for good pasture or signs of water, but for the subtle narratives written in strata and stone. He had been a surveyor in his youth, a man who translated the earth's raw geometry into the neat lines of maps, but his true passion was the earth itself, its history, its silent testimony. He taught Adeline not how to mend a fence or brand a calf, but how to read the language of the terrain. He showed her how a line of juniper trees, stunted and bent in the same direction, spoke of a prevailing wind that could scour topsoil from a field in a single season. He taught her that a patch of alkali grass, pale and sickly, was a warning of sour water unfit for man or beast lying just below the surface. He gave her a vocabulary of erosion, of sedimentation, of geological time that made the world around her seem less like a static landscape and more like a slow, deliberate story unfolding over millennia. It was a strange education for a girl in a territory that valued strong backs over sharp eyes, but she had absorbed it all, storing the knowledge away like preserves in a cellar. The story of the stone-faced pilgrims was his favorite. He told it on cool evenings, sitting on the porch as the sky bled from orange to violet, the river stone cool in his hand. They weren't after gold, Addie, he would say, his voice low and confiding. Gold is a fool's errand. It makes men mad. They were carrying something far more precious. He claimed they were a small, devout sect from a land of tired, over-farmed soil, and they had spent years gathering their treasure, a library of seeds. Not just wheat and corn, but heirloom vegetables, medicinal herbs, grains from ancient lines, all carefully packed in clay and wax, a genetic ark intended to found a new Eden in the untamed West. They had vanished without a trace sometime in the 1790s, swallowed by the vast, unforgiving plains. The story was dismissed by everyone else as local folklore, a ghost story to explain the strange melancholy of the landscape. But Orrin believed it. He saw the proof in the land itself, in faint depressions he claimed were not natural, in the unusual scattering of rocks that suggested a great upheaval. He gave her the river stone on her 16th birthday. It came from the deep channel, a place the old floodwaters scoured clean, he'd told her. It's a key without a lock. Remember that. The land will show you the lock when you're ready. Her husband, Thomas, had listened to the stories with a gentle, patient smile. He had loved Adeline, and by extension, he had loved the eccentric old man who saw history in every pebble. Thomas was a man of the land in a different way. He saw its potential for pasture, for a herd of cattle, for a future built on sweat and toil. He had bought this parcel precisely because it was cheap, its arid reputation scaring off other settlers. He and Orrin had walked its boundaries together, the old man pointing out geological oddities while Thomas assessed the grazing potential, a partnership of dreamer and pragmatist. But a fever, swift and merciless, had taken Thomas a year ago, leaving Adeline with a half-finished dream and a mountain of debt. He left her the ranch, the dog Sundance, and the crushing weight of his brother's disapproval. The rupture, when it came, was as quiet and bloodless as a page turning in a ledger. Thomas's brother, Marcus, arrived not in a rage, but in a clean buggy, his face a mask of grim duty. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He simply sat at her kitchen table, the silver dollar already on the polished wood between them, and laid out the facts. The note at the bank was due. The herd was not large enough to cover it. He had made an arrangement. He was taking the remaining cattle, the good horses, the wagon. It was, he explained in a monotone that scraped her nerves raw, the only way to settle Thomas's accounts and preserve the family name from the stain of bankruptcy. It's a shame, he said, his eyes focused on a point just over her shoulder. Thomas was never practical. He pushed the silver dollar toward her. For a meal. There's a train east on Friday. I've spoken to the station master. He'll hold a ticket for you. Adeline said nothing. She stared at the coin, a paltry silver sun on the dark wood. The world had shrunk to this table, this coin, this man who shared her husband's blood but none of his warmth. She did not cry or plead. The lessons her father had taught her were not about fighting men like Marcus, they were about enduring forces of nature, and Marcus, in his cold, implacable way, was a force of nature. I'm staying, she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it filled the small room. Marcus simply shrugged, a minute gesture of finality. He stood, put on his hat, and walked out of the house without a backward glance. He did not say goodbye. The sound of his buggy fading down the long dirt track was the sound of her old life ending. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute. She was alone. The days that followed bled into one another, a uniform tapestry of heat and labor. Her world was no longer a ranch, it was a holding, a patch of earth she was tied to by little more than memory and a stubborn refusal to be erased. The journey she undertook was not across miles, but across the barren expanse of her own property, a solitary pilgrimage through a kingdom of dust. She was not cast out into the wilderness, she was the wilderness's captive queen, ruling over an empire of scrub brush and cracked earth. Her mornings were spent at the well, coaxing a trickle of brackish water from its depths, a slow, rhythmic task that mirrored the slow drip of time. Her afternoons were for mending fences that enclosed nothing, their taut wires a testament to a purpose that no longer existed. It was a mad act, patching a container for emptiness, but the work was real. The splintered wood, the sharp bite of the wire, the ache in her shoulders, these things were solid, grounding her in a world that had become spectral. Her only companion was Sundance, the golden retriever Thomas had given her as a pup, his coat the color of dried prairie grass. The dog followed her everywhere, a silent, warm shadow, his presence a constant, low hum of life against the oppressive silence. He would lie with his head on his paws while she worked, watching her with an unnerving, patient intelligence. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch together and watch the sun die, the sky putting on its grand, funereal display for an audience of two. It was during these quiet hours that her father's voice would return to her, not as a haunting, but as a quiet counsel. The land doesn't forget, she could hear him saying, his voice as calm and steady as it had been in life. You just have to know how to ask it the right questions. The aphorism, once a piece of charming folklore, now felt like a practical instruction, a map she had been given long ago and had only just learned to read. She began to walk. Not with the purposeful stride of a rancher checking her property, but with the meandering, observant gait of her father. She carried his legacy in her pocket, the smooth, dark river stone. Its weight was a familiar comfort. She started in the North Quarter, the most arid and useless part of the ranch, a place Thomas had written off as wasteland. She walked for hours, her eye scanning the ground, ignoring the horizon. She was seeing the land through Oren's eyes now, translating its textures and contours into his geological language. She saw the story of a million-year-old seabed in a layer of compressed shale. She saw the violence of ancient floods in the alluvial fans of gravel splayed at the mouths of dry washes. The work was hypnotic. It emptied her mind of Marcus, of the debt, of the train ticket east. It filled her instead with the vast, slow, unpitying reality of the earth. She was a tiny, fleeting thing on a canvas of immense age and power, and in that realization, she found not despair, but a strange and profound peace. She wasn't fighting the land anymore. She was listening to it. The discovery came, as such things often do, not with a thunderclap but with a nuisance. It was late afternoon, the sun a molten coin low in the west, painting the landscape in brutal shades of orange and black. Adeline was heading back toward the house, tired and coated in a fine layer of dust, when Sundance began to bark. It was not his usual greeting bark, nor the sharp alarm he used for rattlesnakes. This was a frantic, insistent clamor, directed at the collapsed wall of a deep arroyo that cut a jagged scar across the property. "Hush, boy," she called, her voice raspy with thirst. But he wouldn't stop. He scrambled down the steep bank and began digging furiously at the base of the overhang, sending sprays of sand and pebbles into the air. With a sigh of weary resignation, Adeline slid down the embankment after him. "What is it? What have you found?" she muttered, peering at the spot. She saw nothing. Just a tangle of dried roots and compacted soil. A wave of bitter disappointment washed over her, sharp and sudden. It was foolish, this walking, this listening to ghosts. Her father had been a dreamer, and she had inherited his most useless trait. She turned to climb back out, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. But Sundance let out a sharp yelp and redoubled his efforts. He paused, looked back at her, and barked once, a sound that was less a command than a plea. Something in his eyes held her there. She knelt, her knees sinking into the loose scree, and looked closer. She brushed away the dirt where he'd been digging. Her fingers met something cold, hard, and unnaturally curved. It wasn't a rock. A jolt, sharp as lightning, went through her. She began to dig with her bare hands, the frantic energy of the dog transferring to her. The dirt was packed hard, but she clawed at it, her nails breaking, her palms scraping raw. Slowly, an object emerged from the earth. It was a band of iron, pitted and scaled with a century of rust, but its shape was unmistakable. A wheel rim. Thick, heavy, forged for a purpose. It was real. She sat back on her heels, the breath knocked out of her. Her gaze lifted from the rim, following the line of the arroyo wall. And then she saw it. Her father had taught her what to look for, the subtle signs of human disturbance, the unnatural geometry that time could not quite erase. Faintly, under the shifting skin of the desert, were depressions in the earth. A dozen of them, spaced almost evenly apart, following a line that led directly into the collapsed wash. They were not water holes. They were not buffalo wallows. They were graves. She had found their graveyard. The labor that followed was a singular, all-consuming act of will. Adeline had a shovel with a splintered handle and a pickaxe whose head was perpetually threatening to loosen. These were her only tools against the accumulated weight of 90 years of earth. The sun became her adversary, a relentless eye in a bleached white sky, beating down on her as she worked. She rose before dawn, the air still cool and smelling of stone, and worked until the light failed, her shadow stretching long and skeletal behind her. The narrative of those days was written in sensation. The rhythmic shink of the shovel biting into the compacted soil, a sound that became the percussion of her life. The jarring shock that traveled up her arms each time the pickaxe struck a rock. The grit of dust that coated her tongue, her teeth, her eyelashes, a constant, abrasive presence. The sweat that stung her eyes and pasted her hair to her scalp, leaving white salt stains on her clothes as it dried. The air was thick with the smells of dry clay, of sun-baked iron, and a faint, deeper odor of ancient, decaying wood. She focused on the first depression, the one nearest the arroyo. It was a slow, punishing process. She was not just digging, she was performing an archaeology of sorrow. The first few feet were just soil and rock, but then the texture changed. The shovel began to bring up splinters of wood, dark and friable, that crumbled to dust in her hands. Then, a larger piece, the curved rib of a wagon's canopy, impossibly fragile. She abandoned the shovel for her hands, scooping and brushing the earth away with a tenderness that felt like reverence. Slowly, painstakingly, she unearthed the skeleton of a prairie schooner. The wheels were gone, the canvas had long since rotted away to nothing, but the basic frame remained, a ghostly outline pressed into the earth. There was nothing inside but dust. She moved to the next depression, and the next, a grim and methodical harvest. Each one told the same story of decay and collapse. 10 wagons, then 11, each one a monument to a failed dream, each yielding nothing but rusted fittings and rotted timbers. Doubt began to creep in, a cold shadow at the edge of her exhaustion. Perhaps her father's story was just that, a story. Perhaps the treasure was the iron itself, a meager salvage. but there was a 12th depression, set slightly apart from the others, tucked against a rock outcropping that might have offered some small protection from the flash flood that had clearly entombed them. This one was deeper, the digging harder. Her pickaxe struck something that was not rock. It was a dull, metallic thud. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She dug with renewed ferocity, her movements precise and desperate. She uncovered an axle, thick and solid, and wedged beneath it, protected from the crushing weight of the earth, was a chest. It was not a grand, ornate treasure chest from a storybook, but something far more practical and grim. The heavy, rectangular box, its wood bound with iron straps and lined, she would later discover, with lead. It was sealed shut, its lock a single mass of rust. Getting it open consumed an entire day. She had no tools for such a task. She tried to pry it with the blade of the shovel until the handle cracked. She hammered at the hinges with the flat of the pickaxe, the noise shockingly loud in the vast silence. Finally, in a moment of desperate inspiration, she used the unearthed axle as a lever. Placing a rock for a fulcrum, she put all of her weight onto the long piece of wood. The rusted hinges groaned, resisted, and then, with a screech of tortured metal that seemed to tear the air, the lid sprang open. She peered inside, her breath held tight in her chest. It was not gold. There were no jewels, no stacks of coins. The chest was packed tight with dozens of small clay jars, each one sealed with a thick plug of dark wax. A library, just as her father had said. Tucked carefully amongst the jars was a small, leather-bound book, its cover stiff and warped. And nestled beside it, a single object wrapped in what was once fine linen, now little more than a fragile, yellowed web. She unwrapped it carefully. It was a silver locket, tarnished almost completely black, its chain a delicate, broken thread. Later that evening, by the flickering light of a single candle in the quiet of her kitchen, Adeline opened the leather-bound journal. The pages were brittle, the ink a faded brown, but the script was elegant and clear. It was a woman's hand. The first page read, "The Journal of Isabella Reed, commenced on the 4th of April, 1798." Adeline read for hours, the world outside her small circle of light ceasing to exist. She read of their journey, of their faith, of the precious cargo they carried. She read of their hopes for a new beginning in a land of plenty. And then she came to the final entry. Her hands trembled as she read the words, and she found herself whispering them aloud, giving voice to a ghost across 90 years. The rain came without warning, Isabella wrote. A wall of water down the dry wash. It took 2 of the wagons and broke the axles on the rest. We are trapped. The fever began 3 days ago. Mr. Shaw was the first to be taken by the Lord, and now my own beloved James is fading. He grows cold. We all know our time here is short. The seeds must survive. It was our life's work, our covenant. This morning, the few of us with strength remaining buried the chest under the axle of the last wagon. We have prayed that Providence will one day guide a worthy soul to this place. It is not a treasure for one, but a legacy for many. James passed just as the sun was setting. My heart is a hollow thing in my chest. I have placed my locket in the chest with our future. It holds the likeness of our sweet Mary, who we buried at sea. Now, mother and father and child will be together in spirit, and our dream will be planted in this new earth. May God have mercy on our souls. Adeline closed the journal, her fingers tracing the worn leather. The silence in the room was different now. It was not empty. It was filled with the weight of Isabella's grief, her sacrifice, her unwavering hope. This was not a discovery of wealth, it was the acceptance of a sacred trust. The story was no longer her father's folklore. It was her responsibility. The next morning, Adeline packed a small steel bag. She took the journal, the locket, and 3 of the sealed clay jars. She saddled the old mare, the last horse Marcus had deemed not worth taking, and rode west, toward the small, dusty settlement of Redemption. She was no longer just a widow on a failing ranch. She was a courier, carrying a message 90 years old. As she rode, the sun at her back, she felt the weight of the task ahead. She looked different, she knew. The sun had burned her skin to the color of old leather, and there was a new hardness in her eyes, a resolute stillness that had not been there before. She was not a woman who had found a fortune. She was a woman who had been given a purpose, and the weight of it was both a burden and a ballast, holding her steady against the world. She rode into the single dusty street of redemption not with triumph, but with a quiet, unshakable gravity. Her first stop was the Mercantile, a long, low building that smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust. Behind the counter stood Martha, the proprietor, a woman whose face was a roadmap of hard-won survival, her grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. She was known for her fairness, but also for her complete lack of sentimentality. Adeline didn't plead or ask for credit. She placed one of the clay jars on the counter between them. "I need supplies," Adeline said, her voice even. "Flour, salt, bacon. And tools." A new shovel, a pry bar, and rope. Martha eyed the jar, then Adeline's sun-scorched face. "What's this?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "And what are you paying with?" Adeline took a small knife from her pocket and carefully scraped away the wax seal. She tipped the jar, and a stream of small, dark, unfamiliar seeds poured onto the countertop. They were unlike the corn or bean seeds Martha sold every day. "A share," Adeline said simply. "A share of whatever this grows." Martha scooped up a few seeds, rubbing them between her thumb and forefinger. She saw no currency, but she saw the fierce, unwavering determination in Adeline's eyes. It was a look she recognized. It was the look of a person betting everything on a single, desperate chance. "It's a poor wager," Martha said, but she was already turning to gather the flour. "But I'll take it." Next, Adeline went to the blacksmith's forge at the edge of town. The ring of hammer on anvil was the town's heartbeat. Finn, the smith, was a mountain of a man, his arms corded with muscle, his face perpetually smudged with soot. He listened to her story of a buried chest with a deep, rumbling laugh. "A lost wagon train? Lady, I hear a story like that once a week from some prospector with more hope than sense." He turned back to his fire. Adeline didn't argue or try to persuade him. She walked to her mare, untied the heavy, rusted wheel rim from behind her saddle, and dragged it into the forge. The effort made her grunt, but she dropped it onto the dirt floor with a loud clang. The sound made Finn turn. He stopped, his hammer held in mid-air. He walked over, knelt, and ran a practiced hand over the pitted iron. He recognized the craftsmanship, the style of the forge weld. It was old. Very old. He scraped at the rust with a file, examining the metal beneath. His skepticism dissolved, replaced by a craftsman's professional curiosity. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice now low and serious. "I need help moving something heavy," Adeline replied. "There's more metal where that came from. Axles, fittings. You can have all of it. I just need the chest." Finn stared at the wheel rim, then back at Adeline. He nodded slowly. "I'll get my wagon and the draft team." Her last visit was to a small, neat cabin set back from the road, where a man named Ben lived. He was a quiet man, of mixed heritage, who kept to himself but was rumored to know the local land better than anyone, not just its surface, but its soul. He listened to her without interruption, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. Words, she sensed, were not his preferred currency. So she offered him something else. She opened Isabella's journal to a page detailing the herbs and grains they carried, with notes on their planting and use. She handed it to him. Ben took the book with a gentle reverence. He traced the faded script with a calloused finger, his lips moving silently. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. These were not just seeds, they were names he had heard in the stories of his grandmother, plants that had grown here long ago, before his time. He looked up from the journal, his gaze meeting Adeline's. He saw the journal, the seeds, and the woman who brought them not as a discovery, but as a return. He handed the book back to her and gave a single, decisive nod. He would help. The journey back to the arroyo was a strange procession, Adeline on her mare, Finn driving his heavy wagon pulled by two massive draft horses, Martha following in her buckboard laden with supplies, and Ben riding alongside, silent and watchful. There was no grand speech, no pact sworn. Their alliance was an unspoken thing, forged in a shared glance of understanding, in the pragmatic assessment of a need and a competence to meet it. When they arrived at the site, the raw, excavated earth looking like a fresh wound in the landscape, a quiet efficiency took over. Finn, the practical engineer, surveyed the problem of the heavy chest. He set up a block and tackle system, using the sturdy rock outcropping as an anchor, his powerful horses providing the force. The air filled with the creak of rope, the jingle of harnesses, and Finn's low commands to his animals as the lead-line chest was slowly, painstakingly hauled from its 90-year-old grave. While Finn worked, Ben walked the surrounding land. He crumbled the soil in his hands, smelled it, tasted it. He noted the angle of the sun and the patterns of water flow from the last rain. He was not looking for a place to put a farm, he was looking for a place the seeds would recognize as home. He finally chose a small, sheltered patch of land near the well, a place Adeline and Thomas had overlooked. Here, he said, the single word carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Meanwhile, Martha, with the methodical precision of a shopkeeper, had laid out a canvas sheet and was carefully unsealing the clay jars one by one. She sorted the seeds into small piles, her lips moving as she cross-referenced them with the descriptions in Isabella's journal, her mind already calculating, planning, seeing not just seeds but a future pantry. Adeline moved between them, a quiet hub at the center of this new wheel of activity. She brought them water, helped steady the ropes for Finn, held the journal for Martha, and listened as Ben explained the nature of the soil. They were four disparate souls, a widow, a merchant, a smith, and a guide, bound together by a promise made by a ghost. In the shared sweat and dust of that long afternoon, a community began to take root. The first green shoots were a miracle. They pushed through the soil of Ben's chosen garden bed with a tentative but fierce energy, a vibrant refutation of the dust that surrounded them. Ben showed Adeline how to tend them, using ancient techniques of watering and care that his people had perfected over centuries. The work was constant, but it was a labor of hope, not desperation. The plants that grew were extraordinary. There were stalks of grain that grew taller and fuller than any Adeline had ever seen, strange and wonderful vegetables in colors she didn't know existed, and herbs whose potent, unfamiliar scents filled the evening air. The garden became an oasis, a patch of impossible life in a landscape of death. The story of Adeline's find, and the strange, bountiful garden that resulted, spread through the territory. People began to travel to Redemption not just for supplies, but to see the living proof of the legend. With the income from the first harvest, which Martha sold for prices that were both fair and astonishing, Adeline rode to the county seat. She walked into the bank, her head held high, and paid the note on the ranch in full. The banker, a man who had been preparing to foreclose, could only stare as she laid the cash on his desk. The land was hers. Truly hers, bought not with a dead husband's failed dreams but with the fruits of a dead woman's hope. She returned to the ranch not just as its owner, but as its partner. She was no longer a custodian of dust, she was a cultivator of life. She did not hoard the seeds. She understood Isabella's final wish, it was a legacy for many. She established a trade, offering seeds from the heirloom stock to any settler willing to learn the careful methods of raising them. She traded for livestock, for lumber, for the things she needed to rebuild her home and her life. Redemption began to earn its name, transforming from a parched outpost into a place of new beginnings, its future sown from a past that had almost been forgotten. The sun was setting, casting long, peaceful shadows across the valley. Adeline stood on her porch, the air cool on her skin. Her house was no longer just a shelter but a home, its windows glowing with warm lamplight. The fields around it, once barren, were now a patchwork of green and gold. The silence was still there, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the sound of absence, but the sound of peace, of things growing, of a life being patiently built. In one hand, she held the smooth, dark river stone her father had given her, the key that had fit a lock of landscape and time. In the other, she held Isabella's silver locket, which she had polished until it shone. She clicked it open. The tiny, faded portrait of the long-lost child, Mary, looked out with solemn eyes. She looked from the stone to the locket, from her father's legacy of seeing what was hidden to Isabella's legacy of planting a future for strangers. The silver dollar Marcus had given her was long since spent, a meaningless token of a world that no longer had any claim on her. But the stone and the locket, the faith of a father and the hope of a stranger, this was her true inheritance.